Hi everyone, Tyler Manion here, NPC Worldwide and IFBB Pro League Vice President. Today we're going to do a recap of the Mr. Olympia. This will be about the open division. I'm going to review Derek and Hadi, obviously because it was a very close show between those two. I'm going to go pose by pose in detail and in depth into what we saw at the table. Then I'll also cover third, fourth, and fifth place, Samson, Brandon, and Andrew, and what they need to work on going forward to be competitive with these top two and, to come back. And obviously they all want to win the title of Mr. Olympia next year. But before I get into the breakdown, I want to dispel a certain notion that I always hear and keep hearing about, and it's the common expression of to beat the champ, you have to knock him out. Now, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about open or any other division. And that is just a statement that I personally do not agree with, okay? How we all judge at the table, it doesn't matter if you have 8 titles, it doesn't matter if you have 0 titles. The best person on that day, the person that we think best fits the criteria, is who we're going to put in first place. It doesn't matter what their past history is. That is not taken into account when we're looking. We're looking at what's on stage in front of us that day, and that's all that matters. So that common expression, to beat the champ, you have to knock him out. Throw that out the window. That is not used at all while any of our judges are judging shows and we're at the table. So the first pose up is the front double bicep pose. As you see here with Derek improved his arms from last year. He improved his legs from last year. His quads, the overall density and sweep to his quads came up dramatically from last year. All you have to do is go look at pictures or videos of Derek from last year to Derek from this year. Derek has a crazy, crazy taper with crazy wide flaring lats, all down into a very small waistline. His arms flow very proportionally with his body, and his legs now have much more balance compared to his upper body. Now we look at Hadi's front double bicep pose. His arms flow pretty well into his physique, although I would argue here that Derek's arms flow better with his pose. Hadi has a very good taper, but next to Derek's taper, it is not as prominent. Hadi's waist is wider, and his lats are not as wide as Derek's. Then we move down to the lower body. Hadi still has strong quads. Yes, they're also in good condition as well. However, Hadi has an imbalance between his left and right quads. His sweep on his left side is more pronounced than his sweep on his right side. That is symmetry. So that is an imbalance, and we take that into account as well. Next up is the front lat spread pose. So as you see, Derek brought his arms and shoulders, not only the size, but also the detail for his arms and shoulders up from last year. Okay, we're still looking at every single body part in this pose. I've already covered the lower body between Derek and Hadi's quads, so we know what's going on with the lower body. In the upper body in this pose, they both have very wide lats, again, that flow down into nice tight waists. However, when you look at the V-taper here, you see Derek does still have a better V-taper than Hadi. However, when you go up into the fullness and detail of the chest, Hadi still has an advantage there. Hadi still has a nice V-taper overall, even though there is the imbalance in the legs. The size is comparable, even if Derek's are just a little bit bigger now. But overall, also with the midsection and even with the waist, partially sucked up, partially vacuumed, right? The detail all throughout Hadi's core and his chest still gives him the edge in this pose. As you can see in this real close-up video and what we were seeing from the table, Derek took a pose that is not his strongest and made gains on it. However, this is still a pose that goes to Hadi. So now it's 1-to-1. Hadi takes the front lat spread. Next up, we have the side chest pose. Now again, as I explained in the criteria video, we're looking at everything here in the side chest pose. We want to look at the width from shoulder to shoulder up top. We're looking at the details in the size of the arms and the shoulders and how they flow. Okay, your waist needs to be in tight. We're obviously looking at the side leg here, okay, for the lower body. And of course, we're looking at the chest. We're looking at how thick it is, how detailed it is, okay? So now when we take this pose and compare Derek and Hadi, Derek improved this pose tremendously from last year. You can see all the new tissue in this pose that he added to his chest. You can also see striations He actually has striations on the inside of his chest here, the backpack, and you can see the thickness in his chest now. Then you look at the density and detail that he added to his arms and shoulders from the outside. This improved a lot from last year. Then we go down to his lower body and his side leg. His side leg was crazy detailed and crazy dense and bigger than last year. So when we compare this to Hadi, Hadi has a very striated chest. So chest alone, yes, Hadi's chest is better than Derek's. Both their midsections are partially hidden here, but they both have them in tight. So this isn't a pose where you see Hadi's crazy detailed serratus come into play here. Through the shoulders up top, Derek is wider than Hadi. Derek also has a little bit more detail in his shoulder than Hadi's shoulder. Hadi's shoulders are not striated. They are not striated and show the same detail as his chest or his abdomen does. Hadi's arms and shoulders flow, and the details in them are, in my opinion, not as good as Derek's in this pose. Then we go down to the lower body, and Derek's side leg is a good bit better than Hadi's side leg now. It is definitely bigger, and you can definitely see more details in Derek's side leg than you can see in Hadi's. This turned from a weak pose for Derek that last year, in my opinion, I had Hadi winning this pose over Derek. This year, I thought it was clear that Derek took this pose. So as of right now, the poses are 2-1 with Derek taking the side chest this year. Next up is the back double bicep pose. I think this is the clearest pose out of all poses that Derek wins this hands down, as he has right now by far the best back double bicep in the whole entire IFBB Pro League. What makes Derek's back double bicep so strong? As you see, and as I've talked about earlier, he has added more to his arms and shoulders, especially from the outside, which is the part of the arm we're seeing here. We see the clear separation and the clear definition of his bicep, his tricep, and his shoulders. They flow very well into the most dense and widest back that we have in the Pro League right now. Then we move to his lower body. He has insane detail from the glutes all the way down. His hamstrings and his legs from the back not only increased in the detail that we're seeing, but they also increased in the leg width. So the amount of space that his legs take up on stage, that has increased as well. This is an extremely dominant pose here for him against Hadi. Now, Hadi still has a solid back double bicep. However, his back is not as deep and as dense as Derek's here. His shoulders are not showing as much detail, and his legs are not taking up as much space in leg width, and they also are not showing as much detail throughout the hamstring from the back of the leg. So this pose goes to Derek. The score is now 3 poses to 1 pose with Derek taking this back double bicep. Next up is the back lat spread pose. We've already covered in the last pose that lower body and legs in the pose, Derek is ahead of Hadi for the reasons I stated with detail and width. Now, when you look at the back here, Derek's back lat spread is still a very, very strong pose for him. Again, he is very wide, and you can see a lot of depth and density to his back in the details when he is hitting the lat spread. All of it comes down into a nice small waist. His rear delts flow nicely right into his back. Everything about this pose is very, very strong. Hadi also has a very strong back lat spread. Now, Hadi shows great width when he hits this back lat spread pose. However, you can see he doesn't have the same density and depth to the back as Derek does here, as it looks just a little bit flatter than Derek's does. Then when you combine that with Derek taking the lower body and lower half of this pose goes to Derek, which now makes it Derek 4 poses, Hadi 1 pose with Derek taking the back lat spread. Next up is the side tricep pose. We're looking for the width from shoulder to shoulder. We're still looking at the chest thickness. We're looking at a nice tight waist, the details through the abs. We're looking at the arm, the shoulder. Obviously, we want to see the tricep, how big and how defined your tricep is. Then, after we get below the waist, we're looking at the side leg again. So, in the side tricep pose, this is a very close pose. Some can argue this might be the most important pose between these two and how different judges looked at the show. So, here from the side tricep, when you look at width from shoulder to shoulder, Derek is wider than Hadi. Now, again, you can see the new tissue Derek added to his chest here. He has chest thickness here. Just as much thickness as Hadi does. However, Hadi has more striations and details through the chest. Now, when you look at the waist, they both flow into a nice tight waist. However, Hadi has details throughout his serratus and abs that are more detailed than Derek's. However, you can see Derek's abs very clearly here as well. Now, when you move into the arm and the shoulder part of the pose, Derek has a better flow from his shoulders to his arms and bigger triceps and arms than Hadi does in this pose. Then we go into the lower body, and Derek's side leg is a good bit bigger and more detailed, like I covered before in the side chest. That is better than Hadi's side leg. So when you take everything into account here and look at how we look at this overall pose, Derek wins the side tricep because he is superior in more phases of this pose than Hadi. Hadi has more detail to his chest and more detail through his abdomen, but when it comes to the width through the top in this pose, the arm definition and size, and the side leg, Derek takes all those facets. So for me, Derek edges out this pose and puts the score now at 5 poses to 1 pose. Derek is leading. Next up is the ab and thigh pose. So in this pose, we're looking from their hands all the way down to their feet, right? So Hadi does the hands overhead, normal ab and thigh pose. He can pull off all 3 variations, but this was the one he was hitting the most in the comparisons. In this pose, his arms flow nicely down into nice flaring lats that show a nice V-taper into the deepest and most detailed core in the entire IFBB Pro League. That makes this pose extremely, extremely strong for Hadi. Again, his legs are still solid, and when you compare that to Derek, Derek was hitting most of the time a vacuum pose here. Now, he hit the abs flexed a couple different times, but not for too long, and was really pulling the vacuum pose. Now, he's pulling the vacuum pose because he is playing to his strengths, right? When he pulls the vacuum pose, again, he's showing off his taper. He has flaring lats down to a nice small waist. He's pulling his abs up because when he was crunching them down, it was making his waist look wider. And then he made all the improvements that we had previously talked about through his quads. However, your eyes are directly drawn right to Hadi in this pose, even with Derek making this improvement with hitting the vacuum pose, which he tried to hit last year and didn't do it that well. He hit it way, way better this year to make it a way better pose for him. However, next to Hadi, it's still not nearly strong enough, as he has right now the strongest and most detailed ab and thigh pose in the IFBB Pro League. So Hadi takes this pose, and it is now 5-2 going into the last pose. And lastly, we have the most muscular pose. Again, this is a very, very strong pose for Hadi. I think actually the way he hits this pose really helps him as well, as it contributes to making his arms and shoulders look bigger. Also, it contributes to making him look wider from shoulder to shoulder across top, because he hits it with his knuckles like this instead of having his hands clasped. Then obviously he shows off his crazy striated chest, his insane core, and then flowing down into his lower body. Again, I've already addressed that even with a slight imbalance, he still has strong legs, even if they are a little bit smaller than Derek's. In this pose, everything else is so strong, and he even actually in this pose makes himself look wider than Derek, which is very hard to do. Now, Derek improved this pose a lot from last year. Again, as I've said before, he brought his arms and his shoulders up. He brought his chest up, and he brought his legs up. You can still see his abs through this pose, so you're seeing defined abs this year, which you did not see last year. You're seeing thickness to the chest, but it is not striated or as densely muscled as Hadi's yet in this pose. Hadi's striations are crazy. Derek's muscle, as you can see, is new muscle, and it just doesn't have those striations to it yet. Also, with Derek hitting it with his hands clasped, you can see he does not look as wide as Hadi in this pose. So, for all of these reasons, it is such a strong pose for Hadi that Hadi still takes it. This makes the score 5 poses to Derek, 3 poses to Hadi. So, obviously, Derek wins all the mandatory poses from what I saw, 5-3. This would give him the edge this year to win the title. Now, as all of you saw, not all the judges agreed. This was a very, very close show. Now, last year, I had Haughty winning 5 poses to 3 poses, and the 2 poses that flipped for me from last year to this year were the 2 side poses. The side chest especially flipped completely, which was a surprise, and the side tricep pose, which was a close pose for sure. There's no doubt about it. The side tricep was a close pose, but I gave that pose to Derek this year. Now that we covered what a close show was between the top 2, I'll move into the rest of the top 5. In third place, we had Samson, who, again, has improved from show to show, and it's very clear of his improvements. Now, what does Samson need to do? I would say if there's one body part Samson can improve, it would be his back. Number 1, continue to try to get wider. Now, he can also keep adding to the density in his back as well. As you can see, he's going up against guys that have very wide and very dense backs. So this is his number 1 focus. Everywhere else, he does not need any more size. You can even see in a lot of these poses when he's next to these guys, if he just gets more conditioned, he is going to start overtaking one or both of them in definitely some poses. So if Samson can keep improving his conditioning, which even looking at everything right now, I would say Samson improved on it a little bit from the Arnold. However, at the Arnold, he was standing next to a little bit of a smaller version of Andrew and a little bit of a downsized version, especially in the legs, of Nick Walker. Now he was standing next to Haughty and Derek. And you look different depending on who you're standing next to. That changes everything. So against Haughty and Derek, while he has a crazy, crazy advantage in certain body parts in the size, he still needs to dial in that condition more to start taking some of these poses from these guys. He is very much dangerous and in the running going forward into next year. Actually, in general, I think there's quite a few guys that can look at everything and say they have a chance going into the 2024 Mr. Olympia. Samson obviously being one of them. Derek and Haughty have been the top 2 the last 2 years, so of course those 2 as well. Nick Walker, he did not compete, but he is another guy that can look at everything and say he's going to keep improving and be right there with these guys. Then we'll move into 4th place, Brandon Curry. Brandon looked great. This was probably the best he's been conditioning-wise since 2019, I would say, which was his best year. Now, of course, everything didn't go smooth for him. I think he probably lost a little bit of size and separation, especially in his legs. That's the number 1 thing he needs to work on bringing up. Leg width, right? The amount of space his legs take up in the front and in the back poses. Also, he can actually improve on the density of his back as well. He has a great back, but you want to keep improving, especially when you're going up against guys that have great backs. Now, I think Brandon can go and take some time, and hopefully with a smooth prep, he can show these improvements because it seemed like he was on track to show them. If he's able to show these improvements, I think he will be very dangerous moving forward as well. Then in 5th place, we had Andrew Jacked. Now, this definitely wasn't the best version of Andrew we've seen. Obviously, I had the privilege of being able to judge him at the Texas Pro this year. In my opinion, that was the best look he brought to stage. The look at the Olympia was not quite the same. He didn't have the size and the fullness that he had there. And I would even say because of the size and the fullness he displayed in Texas, he looked more conditioned than even he did here at this Olympia. What he needs to improve on going forward, overall leg size for sure. Specifically, he really needs to focus on bringing up the hamstrings. However, I did see a little bit more detail in the hamstrings in his back poses. So he hasn't really had an off season since he turned pro. And my personal advice and feedback to him backstage was to finally take a real off season and see what crazy improvements he can make, because he's been improving basically in 2 years without ever taking a real off season. So if he's able to increase the overall size of his legs, having deeper separation to his quads, having more hamstring, especially from the side and the back poses, more hamstring detail from the back, and then keep working on improving the density to his back. Now, it seems like I'm saying that's a lot, but from how he's been able to show improvements over the last 2 years with really no time off, I think he can go and do all of this and show up next year and really shock everyone with how he looks. He also was posing a little bit strange here again. It seemed like he was going to be on track with his posing, but he started hitting poses and his presentation was a little off as well. I just think this wasn't a complete 100% version of him. But I think even though he took 5th place this year, this guy is a title contender going into 2024 with the other 5 guys that I've mentioned. So there is no one right now that is extremely dominant over anybody else. This is really anybody's ball game going into next year. And I think all of these guys have amazing physiques that I hope everyone out there is really giving them credit for, because the quality is really very high. And I just think it makes open men's bodybuilding so exciting moving into 2024 and beyond, that we have so many guys that we never know how they're going to show up on the day of the show. And we never know what improvements they're going to make, because most of these guys are just showing improvements after improvements in their shows, where anybody can really shock the world going into 2024. So I'm just really excited for the whole entire state of open men's bodybuilding. And I have a feeling, guys, that the shows are going to be really competitive next year, with a lot of guys that have been knocking on the door to qualify for the Olympia and show their improvements coming back next year. And I think it's going to be a really, really strong year. So I hope this recap helped clear up what we saw from the judges' table.